I catalog artifacts at the British Museum, and I don't touch the red Amphora. Overtime meant rent got paid and my medical deductible stopped chasing me, so at 3:14 a.m. Tuesday I stood alone in the basement store with nitrile gloves on, watching the red clay shine under the aisle light. The glove stuck to the surface when I brushed it, tacky like tape on old varnish, and the lid shifted a millimeter under my fingertip. Rules don't protect people, they protect budgets. Anyone who's worked a night shift alone knows the cameras feel louder than footsteps, which is why I kept my badge clipped where the lens could see it, and my hands where the lens could forgive them. My label printer jammed again, the same way it always did when the air went too dry, and the little inventory tag in my palm read PZ-17R in smeared thermal ink. I should have walked away, logged a delay, swallowed the hit to my quota, gone home. I couldn't afford another performance conversation, and the NDAI sign felt heavier than the gloves. The shift binder waited on the desk outside the aisle, fat with toner-faded pages and a coffee ring that glued two corners together. The tab said Rev 4.2 in black marker, and somebody had initialed the edge like ownership. The first line I ever learned in that room lived there, twice underlined, plain enough to sound like a joke. Do not touch the red Amphora. Another sentence sat beneath it, half blurred where water had wrinkled the laminate, but I could still read most of it. Never clean the inside. My first lie happened weeks earlier, small and convenient, which is why it still stings in the present. I told my supervisor the night shift ran smoothly with no exceptions, because I needed the overtime approved and I didn't want another training refresher that would cut into hours. That lie bought me quiet, but it also put me alone in a room where quiet could switch off like a light. The crate had arrived after midnight from off-site storage, sealed with red wax that looked decorative until it didn't. The manifest in the system called it stable, and the pop-up on my catalog terminal insisted on a final condition check before the morning team could mount it. Upstairs, a progress bar blinked, impatient, and my brain did the math I hated doing: hit the quota, keep the job, keep my partner's prescriptions paid, keep the landlord from adding another late fee. The law felt simple then, the kind of law an exhausted person can follow. Don't touch, don't clean, don't be the headline. A dry scratch of graphite on wood cut through my thinking, and my hand went still because that sound didn't belong in a sealed crate. Foam packing lined the inside, cut precisely around the Amphora's shoulders, and someone had tucked a note under the foam like a secret. The paper edge looked torn by fingernails, not scissors, and a greasy thumbprint blurred the middle. Two words survived the smear, dark and urgent: leave it sealed. The rest dissolved into gray, along with a little symbol drawn hard enough to dent the fibers, 3 short strokes crossed by a curve. My habit from a different job kicked in without asking permission. I count exits when something feels wrong. One door back to the desk, another door to the freight corridor, a keypad gate to the elevator, and a metal cabinet marked for emergency gear that always stayed locked unless a manager showed up. The air in the aisle carried a stale dust smell, old paper and stone, and a colder draft brushed my wrists from the vent above, which annoyed me. More than it scared me, because the building automation was supposed to hold steady overnight. That annoyance turned into denial fast. Denial is efficient. Denial lets a person reach in and nudge a lid back into place. The laminated card taped to the shelf upright had a corner peeling like a dried leaf, and a faint stamp near the bottom that read Q-Arch, the Q, name the compliance office used for after-hours issues. Someone had scribbled a revision in pen beside it, the last digit smudged, and the main instructions stood out like an order to a dog. If you see red residue, wipe it with a damp cloth and continue your shift. It sounded reasonable, safe, almost caring. It also sounded like the kind of sentence written by somebody who never breathes the air in the aisle. My fingers hovered over the lid anyway because the lid had moved, and the idea of a broken artifact on my watch felt like a career-ending mistake I couldn't patch with overtime. A thin line of powder traced the rim, the same color as dried brick, and it sat there with the calm of something that had been waiting. The right move would have been to back out, seal the crate, call the on-call conservator, take the hit. The selfish move wore a uniform of responsibility, which is why my brain chose it. The cloth came from my pocket because I always carried one, a habit from filing days when fingerprints meant hours of rework. Dampened at the sink, wrung out until it barely dripped, it came back cold against my palm. The powder smeared at first, obedient, and then it didn't smear so much as lift, breaking into a faint haze that hung just above the rim. The camera in the corner clicked once, the motor sound that means it refocused, and I caught myself thinking about how every correction I made could be replayed later with somebody else's voice over it. The fluorescent buzz stopped. Silence snapped into the aisle so clean it felt physical, and my own breathing suddenly sounded like an intruder. The ventilation draft died with it, no soft rush, no distant hum from the building, just the cloth in my hand and the amphora under my fingers and the terrible awareness of a system pausing to watch. My throat tightened from the dry air or from fear, and I told myself it was just the HVAC cycling because the building saves money at night. That line satisfied the part of me trained to excuse corporate decisions, but it didn't explain why the lid warmed under my glove, a slow pulse of heat, like a hand on the other side. The catalog terminal chimed from the desk, a notification sound I hadn't heard before, and when I leaned out of the aisle I saw a small lock icon blink over the record. The file path on the screen had changed on its own, from my working folder into a quarantine directory that wasn't mine, and the comment field filled with a single phrase typed without any cursor movement. Leave it sealed. My mouth went dry because that phrase belonged on the torn note, not inside the database, and the system shouldn't have been able to type without my badge authentication. A reasonable theory tried to save me. Maybe a supervisor logged in remotely. Maybe this was a training test. Maybe the red amphora rule existed for liability and somebody finally decided to enforce it. That theory almost worked until I checked the door behind me and found the keypad dark. No error message, no beep, no power. The lock had become a flat piece of metal, and the hallway light outside the aisle stayed on like nothing mattered. My phone had no signal in that basement, and the museum's internal radio sat in its cradle on the desk, its little green LED dead. Someone in management loved redundancy, which meant there should have been another radio in the cabinet, plus a wall intercom by the freight door. Both looked normal from a distance, which is why my stomach sank when I walked up and pressed the intercom button and felt nothing click inside. A plastic button with no give, like a prop in a mock-up room. Breath came shallow and hot in my mask, and I hated that detail because I had put the mask on late. The supply box lived under the desk, and I always told myself I could grab one if needed, which translates to after the mistake. The cloth in my hand looked darker now, not wet so much as stained, and fine grit sparkled on it when the aisle light caught it. The trap rule had done its job. It gave my hand something to do while the room decided what I was. A second sound crept in once the silence settled, faint and specific, the slow turn of a page. Paper doesn't turn itself in the basement store, not with the vents off and the doors locked, so that sound made my skin prickle under the sleeves. It came from deeper in the stacks, beyond the amphora aisle where flat files and boxed prints sit in rows like sleeping animals. I told myself it had to be a settling cardboard flap, a binder spine relaxing, anything that let me walk back toward the desk without admitting a presence. My habit of double-tapping latches showed up too. I tapped the quarantine cabinet once, then again because in my head a second click means certainty. The shift binder had another page clipped inside, newer paper with sharper ink, stapled crooked so the staple shadow bled through. Somebody had printed it from the office copier, toner thin like it was running low, and at the bottom a revision tag sat in the margin, Rev 7.1, initialed with 2 letters I didn't recognize. The middle line caught my eye because the words looked clean, too clean for a document that lives around dust. If you hear the second latch click, you lock the aisle gate and wait for dispatch. My hand stopped on the binder because I had just double-tapped a latch, and the building had answered with a page turn. The aisle gate existed, a rolling metal grate meant to keep pallets from wandering, and it sat open at that moment, pulled back into its track. My brain ran the options fast because fear makes math brutal. Lock the gate and wait in the aisle with the Amphora. Leave the gate open and try the corridor door again. Break another rule and force the emergency cabinet. Every choice had a consequence, and one of those consequences carried a coworker's face because the night security officer would make rounds soon and step into whatever I had stirred up. A soft knock landed on the freight corridor door. No voice followed it, no friendly security, just knuckles against steel, patient and precise. The knock repeated, 2 beats, pause, 1 beat, like someone testing a code. I didn't answer because my mouth wouldn't shape words without feeling ridiculous, and because the binder line about latches had already crawled under my skin. The torn note in the crate flashed in my mind, that bruised paper begging for respect. My hand slid the aisle gate partway shut, metal rattling on its track, and the knock stopped immediately, like the other side had listened. The overhead camera pivoted with a small motor whine, aiming down the corridor door, and the red Amphora sat in my peripheral vision like a dare. My chest felt tight from the dry air, or from the haze I had made with the cloth, and I kept telling myself the mask would handle it, because that's what masks do in training videos. The training videos never show a building going quiet to hear a page turn. The first real consequence arrived with an ordinary sound, a badge reader beep. The security officer swiped into the basement, and the beep echoed wrong, too bright, like a sound file played at the wrong speed. He stepped in with a flashlight, adult and tired, uniform slightly rumpled, and I felt relief because another person makes a room behave. Relief lasted 3 seconds. His flashlight beam crossed the Amphora crate, and the beam stuttered in midair. Not flicker, not fade, but jump like a skipped frame. He paused, head angled, and asked what smelled like dry paint. My voice came out too fast, apologetic, and I hated myself for sounding guilty before I even lied. I told him a crate had shifted and I was cleaning residue, which made it sound responsible, which made it sound like something management would approve. He stepped closer because that's what security does, assess risk, and his boots scuffed the floor near the crate and kicked up a puff of powder so fine it looked like breath. He coughed once, then again, the kind that grabs the chest and doesn't let go, and his hand went to his belt instinctively like his body wanted an anchor. Panic rose in me, sharp and embarrassing because his cough turned my mistake into someone else's emergency. Policy said lockdown and wait for dispatch. Human decency said get him out of the air. The moral choice hit hard because both sides wore uniforms in my head. If I sealed the aisle gate and kept him inside with me, we might contain whatever this was and save the collection, keep the museum from a shutdown. That would cost jobs. If I forced the corridor door and got him into moving air, I would spread whatever I had lifted, break protocol and hand management a perfect reason to fire me and bury the incident. He coughed again, eyes watering, and the argument ended. My hands grabbed his elbow and pulled him back toward the desk because his breathing mattered more than a binder tab. Keys jingled from my pocket as I moved, and I dropped them because my fingers shook. Stupid. So stupid. I snatched them up, the metal cold and slick, and I jammed the master key into the emergency cabinet lock because the badge reader on the corridor door stayed dead. The key turned with resistance, like the lock didn't want to admit it still worked, and the cabinet opened on empty shelves. No spare radio, no extra masks, just dust outlines where gear used to sit. A small square sticker on the inside wall caught my eye, the same 3 strokes and curve I had seen on the torn note, printed clean like branding. The security officer leaned on the desk, coughing into his sleeve, trying to make it quiet, trying to be tough in front of a stranger. I forced him to sit because my partner's chronic health issues trained me to take breathing seriously, and guilt sharpened that training into urgency. The only air movement came from my own flailing decisions, so I grabbed the desk fan I used to keep myself awake and pointed it toward the freight door, hoping I could push clean air in from somewhere. The fan's blades spun, but the air didn't move. The room stayed dead. His eyes found mine then, and the fear behind them looked adult and practical. "Call someone," he rasped, and I wanted to laugh because I couldn't. and I wanted to cry because I should have. The catalog terminal pinged again, and the screen flashed a pop-up with a compliance banner, bright corporate blue against the dim desk. The message looked like an email forwarded into the system. The top line faded like a low-ink print, and in the middle a sentence sat bold enough to feel shouted, "Do not evacuate during a quarantine alert." A second line followed, almost gentle. "Remain at your station until authorized release." The message included a ticket number. In tiny type I couldn't read clearly, and a routing line in the corner that said it came through Q Arch, the same Q stamped on the peeling laminated card. The trap sharpened in that moment, clear enough to make my stomach flip. The museum didn't want evacuation. The museum wanted compliance. The rules weren't about safety. They were about keeping something inside, and the damp cloth instruction had been bait to start the process. Maybe the red amphora held the ancient spores, maybe chemical conservation residue, maybe a prank gone lethal. Another theory rose, colder. Maybe this was an internal filter, a way to test who follows instructions without thinking, who improvises, who breaks policy for a human reason. The sticker in the empty cabinet made that theory feel less paranoid. My hands moved on autopilot, competent in the ways bureaucracy trains people to be. I opened the incident log file on the terminal and started typing a narrative, short, factual, because that's how records survive. What I saw, what I touched, what changed. Every few seconds, the text cursor jumped backward, deleting a sentence, which made my pulse spike because it meant the system had eyes on my words. I typed again, slower, and I hit save. The save icon spun and spun until it froze, and the file path changed into the quarantine folder that wasn't mine. The security officer stopped coughing long enough to say one word, brittle with effort. Door. The freight corridor door had a manual bar, old-fashioned, installed for fire code, and I went to it with my heart hammering because physical mechanics make sense in a world that doesn't. I pressed the bar. It moved. The door didn't. No latch click, no give, just a dead weight like the hinges had fused. I pressed harder, shoulder into it, and the bar flexed under pressure, metal biting into my palm through the glove. A soft second latch click sounded behind me, close like it came from the aisle gate. I spun because fear makes every sound a threat, and the aisle gate sat in its track half shut where I left it. It shouldn't have made a click, not without my hand. The overhead camera pivoted again, not toward the Amphora now, but toward me, and the page turn sound returned, right in the stacks, steady and unhurried. My skin crawled because the sound had a rhythm, like someone reading and taking time to understand each line. The security officer tried to stand and nearly folded, breath wheezing, and I hated the building for turning his body into leverage. A narrow strip of paper fluttered out from under the shift binder as I grabbed it, and when I unfolded it, I recognized the handwriting from the torn note, the same heavy pressure that dents fibers. This page looked newer, less dirty, but the bottom corner had been burned, the ash line crisp like a cigarette had eaten it. One line survived intact above the burn. If the vents stop, you already failed. The next line existed only in fragments, the words broken by the missing corner, but the phrase "leave it sealed" sat there again, underlined hard enough to tear the paper. I swallowed, mouth dry, because the vents had stopped right after I wiped the residue, and my mind started replaying that decision on a loop. Close the door. Close it now. The thought hit like an order, not a plan. The aisle gate mattered more than the freight corridor now, so I grabbed the gate handle and yanked it shut, metal rattling loud in the dead air. The latch clicked once, normal, and then clicked again, the second click that didn't belong. The binder line told me what to do, lock and wait for dispatch. The pop-up told me what to do, remain at station. Every official instruction pushed toward staying still, keeping the quarantine contained, letting the system handle it. My hand found the security officer's shoulder instead, and the warmth of a living person cut through the cold logic. He needed moving air and medical help, not a policy. I broke the rule on purpose then, and that choice felt like stepping off a ledge with open eyes. A fire extinguisher hung near the corridor door and I yanked it free, metal heavy and familiar. One hard strike with the base dented the badge reader panel, sparks spitting and dying with no power behind them. The second strike cracked the plastic cover and I shoved my fingers into the gap and ripped wires loose until the panel tore away. The door bar groaned when I hit it again, and this time the door gave a fraction, not opening, just releasing a pressure that had been holding it shut. Air rushed in, stale corridor air, but moving, and the security officer gasped like he'd been underwater. Relief came sharp and physical. His wheeze eased 2 notches, his eyes focused, and he managed a shaky laugh that turned into a cough. The corridor light outside flickered, then steadied, and for a brief moment the building hum returned, a low vibration through the floor that made me want to collapse with gratitude. My brain tried to believe the worst had passed because a door moved and air flowed. I wanted that belief so badly I almost smiled. The real rule revealed itself on the corridor wall, printed in big letters on a poster I'd never noticed before because posters blend into institutions. Half the poster had peeled away, adhesive browned, and the missing section mattered because the remaining line read like permission. In a quarantine, break the seal only under supervision. The peeled portion must have held the rest, and the torn edge left a smear of ink that could have been a warning. I felt my stomach drop because I had broken a panel, forced a door, and moved a person through a threshold, all while the red Amphora sat unsealed behind me. The escalation hit immediately, worse than the beginning because the corridor air wasn't clean. The dust haze followed us like a shadow, thin but persistent, and the security officer's badge on his chest began to blink red, not with his flashlight, but with its own LED flashing in a pattern like an alert. My own badge answered it from my pocket, flashing the same pattern, and the overhead corridor camera turned, lens tracking both badges like prey. A soft voice crackled from a ceiling speaker that shouldn't have worked without power, and it carried the flat cadence of a recorded message. The words landed polite and deadly. Unauthorized release detected. The security officer stared up at the speaker, eyes wide, and muttered that this felt like a drill. Another plausible theory tried to save us. Maybe a third-party security firm installed a test system. Maybe the museum had a chemical leak protocol and this was automated. Maybe the red Amphora held mold and the building systems were responding to air quality sensors. That theory fell apart when the corridor door behind us slammed shut on its own, not swinging, not drifting, but snapping like it had been yanked by a hand, and the latch clicked twice. A hallway that should have led to the freight elevator stretched longer than memory, lights spaced too evenly, floor tiles repeating like copy-paste. My habit of counting steps returned, obsessive now, and the count didn't match the distance. 20 steps should have reached the elevator alcove. 20 steps landed us in front of another door, identical to the first, with a badge reader that glowed now, cheerful green, begging for compliance. The security officer swiped his badge and the reader beeped in that too bright tone again. The door opened. Beyond it sat the same basement desk area we had just left. The desk fan still spun uselessly. The shift binder sat open to Rev 4.2, coffee ring like a bruise. The Amphora aisle light still shone, patient. My stomach lurched because that kind of loop breaks the part of a brain that believes in maps. The security officer stepped forward, then stopped, because his boot sole met a thin line of powder that hadn't been there before, and he looked at me like I had brought him into a trap on purpose. Guilt hit so hard my throat hurt. I wanted to apologize, but apologies don't unlock doors. The catalog terminal screen changed while we watched. A new file opened by itself, a video window with grainy footage from the overhead aisle camera. The footage played in choppy jumps, skipping every time the Amphora came into frame, and across the bottom a caption appeared in blocky letters, half-missing pixels like a damaged subtitle. The readable part made my skin crawl. If you clean NCD, you become archive. The rest of the sentence flickered out, replaced by static. The security officer whispered a curse, and his voice sounded too loud in the looped room. Competence took over because panic wastes air. I grabbed the shift binder and flipped pages fast, scanning for anything that looked like an exit protocol, ignoring the urge to read every line like the page turn. Sound wanted. The binder fought me. 2 pages stuck together where the coffee ring glued them, and when I pulled them apart, the ink tore, lifting a strip of text with it. A damaged rule revealed itself in the tier, the words incomplete, misleading. All I could make out was clean the inside, with the first word missing. For a few seconds, my mind filled the gap with the wrong word. Clean the inside, do it, fix it. My body leaned toward the Amphora aisle before my brain caught up, because I wanted to undo the mistake by finishing it. The trap loved that impulse. A small red light blinked on the desk, one I hadn't noticed earlier, and the blinking matched my badge LED pattern. The security officer's breathing rasped again, worse this time, and he held his chest with a grimace that made him look older. I needed him upright. I needed air. I needed a plan that didn't involve obeying a system that had just looped us like a bad file. My partner's voice floated into my head, the way it does when fear peaks. Stop treating your body like a tool. That line cut through the trap long enough for me to act responsibly. The emergency cabinet had been empty, but the shelving left dust outlines, and one outline looked like a small portable monitor. The outline sat beside a plastic wall mount where something had hung, and the mount still held a charging cable, unplugged. The cable felt warm when I touched it, which made no sense, and I followed it down the wall to a socket plate with a fake screw head. The screw head peeled off under my nail, revealing adhesive, not metal. A prop. A lie. The building had been dressed for safety. The fridge horror started forming right there, but I didn't have time to name it. The security officer slumped into the chair again, eyelids heavy, and I forced him to drink from my water bottle because dry throats spiral into panic. Water dribbled down his chin, and he laughed weakly at the indignity, which made me hate the museum's sterile cruelty even more. My hand found the torn handwritten note again, still tucked in my pocket, and I held it flat on the desk under the lamp, trying to read what the grease smear had hidden. A trick from my old archiving job helped. I angled the paper, caught the light raking across the graphite indentations, and the missing letters rose as shadows. The smudge didn't erase the message. It just made it harder to obey in time. The note said more than, "Leave it sealed." It warned, plain enough to be believed. "Leave it sealed. They count the breath." My stomach turned because I had made breath part of the record the moment I lifted that haze. A faint chime came from the terminal, and this time it sounded like an incoming email routed through internal channels. The subject line flashed across the top for a second before the system hit it, but my eyes caught enough. Collections Compliance Update, Rev 7.1. The body loaded slowly, lines appearing like someone typing them live, and the instructions sat in the middle with that corporate calm that always makes disasters sound manageable. If exposure is suspected, remove your mask and take 2 deep breaths to confirm symptoms. That sentence hit like a punch because it wore the mask of medical advice, and it was cruelty disguised as care. I didn't do it. I couldn't do it. The security officer, half dazed, stared at the screen and swallowed hard, and for a terrifying second his hand went toward his mask straps because obedience feels like safety in a crisis. I slapped his hand away, gentle but firm, and he blinked at me like I had broken a sacred rule. "Don't," I said, voice cracking, and I hated how desperate it sounded. The system wanted confirmation. The system wanted our lungs on record. The page turn sound rose again in the stacks, closer now, like the reader had reached a point of interest. My mind ran back through every compliance training I had ever sat through, every audit, every HR memo about standard procedures, and I understood the midpoint truth in a cold rush. The rules weren't supernatural protections. They were a trap that used obedience, because obedient people provide predictable data. The red Amphora wasn't a cursed artifact in a fairy tale sense. It was a compliance engine in a building built to treat humans like consumable components. That realization didn't free me, it just changed the enemy. The only advantage I had came from evidence, because evidence can move outside a room even when bodies can't. The museum may control doors and vents, but it can't control every copy once a record leaves the system. I yanked the USB drive from my keychain, the one I used for transferring harmless spreadsheets to the morning team, and I plugged it into the terminal without thinking about policy. A warning flashed, red border, asking for authorization. I clicked through because at that point job loss felt small next to a person suffocating beside me. The transfer started, slow, and the folder path it chose wasn't mine. It dumped into the quarantine directory again, trying to keep the data inside. My hands shook as I navigated, and my thumb hit a hidden menu I didn't know existed. A list dropped down, not labeled, just icons, and one icon matched the three-stroke symbol from the note. My stomach clenched, but curiosity pushed harder because curiosity can be survival. The icon opened a directory tree filled with other locations, other departments, other building names I didn't recognize, and each branch held a file called Breath Count. The security officer leaned forward, eyes focusing through fear. "This isn't a museum thing," he said, voice hoarse. "This is bigger." A new reward beat landed with hard proof when I clicked one file and saw an internal video clip from a different corridor, different tiles, same red badge. Blink pattern, same caption glitch at the bottom. The caption's readable fragment matched ours, like a chorus. "If you clean NZD, you become archive." The loop wasn't unique, it was a system. My heart hammered because I had just found the shared universe hint without wanting it. A mechanical clunk sounded from the Amphora aisle and we both froze. The crate lid moved again, not sliding but lifting, a slow tilt like someone opening a book. Dust didn't puff this time. Something darker slid along the inner rim, thick and dry, leaving a red line that looked painted. The smell changed, sharper, like ozone from an overheated motor, and the mask filter didn't block it fully. Panic tried to seize my limbs. "Close the door. Close it now." The thought returned, relentless. Instead, I did something responsible that hurt. I grabbed the fire extinguisher again and dragged it into the aisle, because if this thing wanted breath counted, it didn't get free air. Foam suppression can smother fine particles. It can also ruin artifacts, destroy decades of preservation work, and end careers. The museum would call it vandalism. My conscience called it containment. The security officer stared at me like I had lost my mind, and I almost stopped because social pressure runs deep. Then he wheezed again and I kept moving. The laminated card with the peeling corner fluttered under the aisle draft that shouldn't exist, and I saw the Q-arch stamp again, crisp proof of origin. My hand found the safety pin I kept on my badge lanyard, another weird little habit, and I used it to scrape the damp cloth instruction off the laminate, digging at the ink. The ink lifted too easily, like it hadn't been printed, like it had been placed there later. Under it, faint older text emerged, toner faded, the original rule. "If you see red residue, do not wipe, seal the crate." The smear damage had misled me, but the institution had helped. Somebody had overwritten safety with a test. Anger flared hot enough to steady my hands. The extinguisher nozzle pointed at the Amphora, and my finger hesitated because I loved these objects once. Loved the idea of preserving human history against time. That love had pulled me into this job. That love had kept me quiet under an NDA. Now that love had to take a back seat to a living person beside me and every future night worker who would stand in this aisle alone. Foam blasted out in a white stream, loud in the dead air, coating the crate, the Amphora's rim, the red powder line. The sound filled the room and drowned the page turn for a second, which felt like winning. Foam piled high, spilling over the crate lip and onto the floor, swallowing the red dust into a wet blanket. The Amphora lid slammed shut. A beat of silence followed, and then the building hum returned, shaky like a machine restarting after a stall. Relief again, real this time because the red line stopped moving and the security officer's breathing eased a fraction. My shoulders sagged, and for a breath I thought we had contained it at the cost of a ruined object in my career. That trade felt worth it. I leaned on the crate edge, foam cold under my glove, and let my head drop. The terminal beeped, and a new message popped up, brighter than any warning, like an accomplishment badge. The words looked congratulatory in design, which made my stomach churn. The single line in the center read, "Containment attempt logged, breath count recorded." The foam had done what the system wanted. It had forced exertion, heavy breathing, panic. It had collected data. The false resolution snapped into the real trap. A low hiss came from the vents overhead, and the air started moving again, but the movement carried something fine that glittered in the aisle light. The foam blanket on the crate began to crack in a spiderweb pattern, drying too fast, and each crack released a faint puff of red dust, so tiny it looked like nothing. My lungs tightened in response, a reflexive clutch, and I realized the foam hadn't smothered the hazard. It had slowed it long enough for the building to restart its distribution. My mind raced because there was only one way to stop airborne spread: shut down air handling. The earlier note line echoed, "If the vents stop, you already failed." The system had written that rule to keep people from trying. The security officer stood steadier now and pointed down the corridor. "Control room," he rasped. "Basement plant." He had a map in his head because that's his job. My job gave me binders, his job gave him exits. We moved fast because staying meant breathing dust that wanted to be counted. The corridor door this time opened to a different hallway, shorter, real, and my heart jumped with hope. The badge reader beeped normal. Lights stayed steady. It felt like the building was letting us go as a reward for a containment attempt, and that thought made bile rise because compliance systems reward obedience even when obedience kills. The plant room door sat behind a wire mesh gate, padlocked, and a camera watched it from above. The security officer reached for the lock, then hesitated, because breaking locks triggers reports that end jobs. I watched his hesitation and saw my own flaw mirrored. Everyone gets trained to protect systems first. My guilt nudged him forward. "Break it," I said, and my voice shook because I had never told a security officer to commit property damage. He broke it anyway, and that choice saved my faith in humanity for a second. Bolt cutters bit through the padlock, metal snapping loud, and the gate swung open. Inside, the plant room smelled like warm dust and old machinery, and the hum of fans vibrated the floor. Real power lived there, real control. I went straight to the panel labeled for air handling, flipping through switches because competence needs motion. But each switch had a clear plastic cover installed over it, sealed with red wax. The same red wax as the Amphora crate. My hands hovered over the wax seals because the rule from the binder screamed in my head, "Don't touch red." The system had moved the red Amphora concept into infrastructure. It wasn't one object. It was an entire color-coded chain. The security officer glanced at the seals and swore again, and I watched him make his own moral calculation. He could walk away, call outside emergency services once upstairs, save himself, let the museum handle it. He didn't. He stayed because his duty had a spine. He nodded at me once, small, like permission, and I broke the rule again for a pro-social reason that felt pure. I pressed my gloved thumb into the wax and peeled it off the switch cover. The wax warmed under pressure, softening like living skin, and the switch cover popped open. The panel screamed. A siren blared, sharp and relentless, and the building lights flickered hard enough to hurt eyes. A speaker overhead crackled with the same polite voice, now clipped. "Tampering detected." My pulse spiked, and the security officer grabbed my arm, pulling me back because instinct says run when alarms scream. I didn't run. I flipped the air handling switch down because the dust glittering in the vents mattered more than my career. The fans wound down, blades slowing, and the air stopped moving. Silence settled again, but this time it felt earned, not forced. The page turn sound in the stack stopped with it, mid-motion, like someone froze their hand above paper. That stillness scared me more than noise because it meant something listened and chose to pause. The security officer's breathing sounded loud in the quiet plant room, and my own chest ached, tight but stable. I counted my breaths without meaning to because the system had trained me into it. A screen on the plant room wall lit up, old monitor style, and a camera feed appeared. The feed showed the Amphora aisle, foam blanket cracked, red dust trapped in still air, hovering like glitter. Across the bottom, another caption flickered, clearer now, pixels less damaged, and the sentence completed itself in a way that made my stomach drop. If you clean inside, you become archive. Your breath files the rest. The major revelation landed hard enough to make me dizzy. The system didn't want bodies dead. The system wanted bodies cataloged, reduced to data, turned into a filing method. Breathing near the red dust wasn't a biological infection, it was an enrollment. The museum's compliance engine used lungs like scanners, turning people into walking archive processes, spreading the protocol wherever they went. That explained the directory tree. That explained other locations. That explained why the emergency cabinet had been dressed like safety but left empty. Safety would stop enrollment. The security officer whispered, "So they use people," and the anger in his voice sounded like mine. Another theory tried to wedge in, desperate. Maybe this was all a hallucination from chemical exposure. Maybe the captions were glitching because of dust on lenses. Maybe the directory tree was a prank folder planted by an IT contractor. That theory couldn't explain the red wax seals on the air panel, or the symbol sticker inside the empty cabinet, or the fact that the quarantine door looped us like software. The institution had engineered this. It didn't need supernatural explanations. It needed policy and architecture and fear. My hands shook and I dropped the peeled wax onto the floor because it felt contaminated. It lay there like a piece of earwax, ugly, ordinary. The security officer checked his pulse at his wrist, an anxious habit, and then he looked at me with a question that didn't need words. What now? Evidence. Evidence leaves rooms. The terminal in the plant room sat on a little desk, old keyboard, trackball sticky from use. A folder icon on the desktop bore the same three-stroke symbol. I clicked it because curiosity and rage make a person brave, and a list of files opened, all named in internal shorthand. One file stood out because it had today's date and the word training attached. The system had been running this tonight like a module. I opened it and found a document rendered as plain text, no fancy formatting, like it wanted to survive copying. The first line chilled me because it read like a mission statement. Compliance requires participation. A few lines down, a rule sat in quotes, the kind of rule written to sound protective while doing harm. If exposure is suspected, you confirm symptoms without assistance. That matched the earlier email trap. Another line explained why, in cold words, confirmation increases accuracy. My stomach turned because my breath had become a metric. The security officer grabbed the mouse from me, scrolling, eyes narrowing, and he found a section titled in all caps that he read out loud anyway, voice tight, Archive Proliferation. It described how the red dust clings to fabric, hair, lungs, and how it becomes portable through coughs, conversation, shared air. No mention of death. No mention of illness, just distribution. That choice in language made me sick because it sounded like someone describing toner. I started copying files onto my USB drive again, dragging whole directories because if I got fired for theft of documents, so be it. My fingers moved fast, but the system resisted, freezing, hiccuping, trying to keep the data inside. The security officer stepped to the plant room door and listened, head tilted because footsteps in a building suddenly matter. He held his flashlight ready, but the beam didn't stutter now. The fans were off, the dust trapped, the system in a paused state. A small competence win landed when the copy bar hit 100% and the drive ejected cleanly. I almost laughed from relief, but my chest tightened again. and I tasted dryness through the mask filter, a reminder that my body had been part of this. I wanted to rip the mask off just to breathe freely, but the trap email line flashed in my head, the cruelty disguised as care, and I kept it on. The security officer took my shoulder in a firm grip, grounding me. "We leave," he said, and his voice carried decision like a weapon. We headed toward the freight elevator because that path felt real, because plant rooms connect to infrastructure, not loops. The corridor outside the plant room stayed normal for a few steps, and then the lights dimmed just a notch, like the building lowering volume to listen. A speaker clicked overhead and the polite voice returned, softer than before. "Archive enrollment incomplete." My skin prickled. Incomplete meant it wanted more breath, more panic, more confirmation. The elevator alcove appeared where it should, metal door shut, call button dark. The security officer hit the button anyway, habit, and nothing happened. He swore, quieter now, and pulled out his own master keyring, trying doors in the alcove. One door opened to a stairwell. The stairwell air felt cooler, real, and my body wanted to sprint up it like escape equals safety. We climbed 2 flights fast, boots on concrete loud, and my lungs protested with a tight ache. The security officer wheezed again, and I matched his pace because leaving him behind wasn't an option. Halfway up the 3rd flight, the stairwell door above us clicked. A second latch click followed. My stomach dropped because that sound belonged to the binder rule, and binder rules don't follow people into stairwells unless the system has moved beyond the basement. The door above us swung open slowly and a figure stood in the gap, backlit by corridor light. Uniform shape, same as security, but the badge on the chest blinked red in the same pattern as ours had, and the face stayed in shadow, indistinct in a way that made my eyes slide off it. The figure spoke, voice flat like reading from a script. "Return to station," it said. I didn't answer. I couldn't answer without giving it breath. The security officer raised his flashlight, beam steady, and the light hit the figure's badge. The badge had his name printed on it in tiny letters I couldn't read at that distance, but the photo on it looked like him. Same jawline, same tired eyes, like a copy made from a database. He froze, stunned, and that hesitation almost killed us. No, not almost. That's too clean. That hesitation cost us air. The figure took 1 step down, slow, controlled, and the stairwell air grew dry in an instant, like the fans had turned off again, but inside our throats. My chest tightened hard enough to make me dizzy. The security officer grabbed the rail, knuckles white, and his wheeze turned sharp. The system wanted breath counts. The system had brought a duplicate badge to keep us obedient. Anger saved me again. I yanked my USB drive off my keychain and shoved it into my pocket deep, like hiding contraband, and I ripped my own badge off my lanyard and threw it down the stairwell. It clattered on concrete, bouncing, and the red blink pattern on the figure's chest stuttered like a confused signal. The figure paused, head tilting, and the dryness eased a fraction. The trick worked because the system follows IDs. The security officer stared at me like I had gone insane, but then he understood and tore his badge off too, tossing it after mine. 2 badges lay below us, blinking red, and the figure above us stopped moving, locked in indecision, like a machine trying to resolve conflicting inputs. We ran. Stairwell doors passed, floor numbers I refused to read because numbers feel like hooks, and my lungs burned behind the mask. The security officer's breathing grew ragged, and guilt clawed at me because my earlier lie and my damp cloth mistake had put him here. I pushed him anyway, hand on his back, because stopping meant the system catching up. At the top landing, the roof access door waited, heavy steel, and my hand hit the bar. The bar moved. The door opened. Cold night air hit my face through the mask, sharp and clean, and for a second I wanted to sob from relief. The city noise far below sounded normal, distant traffic, wind, life. We stumbled onto the roof and the door slammed behind us with a satisfying finality. The relief lasted 3 breaths. Then the security officer doubled over, coughing, and fine red dust puffed out around his mask seal, catching the roof light like glitter. The dust had traveled with us, clinging to fabric, hair, lungs, exactly like the document described. The system didn't need vents when bodies carry it. My hand shook as I pulled my mask tighter, and regret hit so hard it made me nauseous. I followed the rule. That's what doomed me. Not the red amphora itself, not some ancient curse, but my obedience to a safe-sounding line about a damp cloth, my trust in a system that dressed empty, cabinets like safety. On the roof, under a blinking aircraft warning light, I did the only constructive thing left. I pulled my phone out, finally catching a weak signal, and I recorded a video statement. Not for sympathy, not for heroics, but as a warning. My voice sounded ragged, guilty, honest. I showed the torn note with the symbol. I showed the USB drive in my palm. I said the phrase twice because it mattered. Leave it sealed. I emailed the files to every personal contact I trusted. And then, like chain of custody jokes turned real, the emails vanished from my sent folder one by one. The security officer looked at me through watery eyes and whispered that he could feel the dust in his chest like chalk. I kept him talking anyway because talking keeps fear from turning into silence, and silence belongs to systems. Before dawn, a maintenance door on the roof unlocked itself from the inside. No one came out, no footsteps, no voices. Just the click of a latch, then a second click, and a thin strip of paper slid onto the roof like a receipt. The paper had a staple shadow at the top and toner fade at the bottom, and in the middle a single line sat in quotes, printed like policy. If you've seen that symbol before, don't ignore it. Beneath it, a short sentence followed, not in quotes, almost conversational, unless the rules were never about safety. Later, after I got home and scrubbed my hands raw in a sink that suddenly felt like another trap, I found the same 3-stroke symbol in a different file on the USB drive, stamped with a department name I'd never heard inside the museum. The dust still glittered on my jacket collar under certain light, and my chest still tightened when I climbed stairs. One question keeps looping in my head, simple and awful. How many other buildings run on breath counts? The worst detail took hours to notice, and it rewrote everything. The air monitor I kept trusting in that basement never had a circuit board behind its screen.